so early in the morning. So for this journal club, we have two articles which we are going to discuss. The first article is Neuroophthalmology, which basically discusses the role of diagnostic MRI in patients who present to us with chronic headaches and do not have papilledema, and where we are suspecting idiopathic intrathecal hypertension. It will be presented by Dr. Vaidehi Sathe. She is a PG student from D.Y. Patil Medical College, and the moderators for the session are Dr. Akshay Bedkare. He is from LV Prasad Eye Institute. He is a consultant in neuro-ophthalmology and pediatric ophthalmology, and he has also completed his fellowship from the same institute. We have Dr. Siddharth Kesarwani. I think he doesn't need any introduction, and Dr. Prachi Agashi, who are from Mumbai. So Prachi has a lot of publications and awards to her and she is practicing in Mumbai too. So I think with that, I would ask Vaidehi to start her presentation. Vaidehi, you can.
Good morning, everyone. So, I'm Dr. Vaidehi Sathe from D.Y. Patil Hospital. Today, we'll be exploring this article that talks about utility of MRI imaging in patients of IIH without papilledema. So, first, a little introduction about the topic. IIH is also called pseudotumor cerebri or benign intracranial hypertension. It means elevated intracranial pressure, but there is no identifiable cause. It's most common in obese young adult women. Symptoms and signs are those of papilledema, namely which would be normal or reduced. Patient would have a headache and nausea. There could also be horizontal diplopia due to sixth nerve palsy, which is a false localizing sign. Patient will also have disc hyperemia, obliteration of cup along with disc edema. On investigations, MRI will show increased optic nerve sheath diameter. There will be reduced pituitary gland height, tortuosity of the optic nerves, and flattening of the posterior sclerotic lobe. Puncture, you see a clear CSF fluid. These are the diagnostic criteria for pseudotumor cerebri syndrome. In the first section, we can see that patient will have papilledema, normal neurologic examination, except for cranial nerve abnormalities, mainly cranial nerve 6. Neuroimaging will reveal normal brain parenchyma without evidence of hydrocephalus, mass or structural lesion. And there is no abnormal meningeal enhancement on MRI. This is done with and without gadolinium for typical patients. But if it's an atypical patient, then you do MRI with and without gadolinium and an MRV. If MRI is unavailable, then a contrast enhanced CT may be used. The CSF composition will be normal and there will be elevated lumbar puncture opening pressures that would be more than 250 for adults and more than or equal to 280 mm H2O for children. If the child is not sedated and not obese, then the value will be more than 250 mm in a properly performed lumbar puncture. In the second part, we can see the criteria for diagnosis of pseudotumor cerebri syndrome without papilledema. So in the absence of papilledema, a diagnosis of the condition can be made if B to E from the above are satisfied, and in addition, the patient has a unilateral or a bilateral abducens nerve palsy. In the absence of papilledema or sixth nerve palsy, a diagnosis of the condition can only be suggested but not made if B to E are satisfied, and in addition, at least 3 of the following neuroimaging criteria are also satisfied. The patient will have empty sella. There will be flattening of the posterior aspect of the globe. There will be distension of the perioptic subarachnoid space with or without a tortuous optic nerve. And there will be sinus stenosis on MRV. Treatment mainly includes weight loss, acetazolamide, furosemide, digoxin, and analgesia. In unresponsive cases, surgical intervention like optic nerve fenestration, shunting, and transverse dural sinus shunting can be done. The role of the ophthalmologist is mainly in the diagnosis of the condition and to alert the physician to the same. And once the diagnosis is done, then The monitoring of the visual function is done by checking visual acuity, color vision, visual fields, and the appearance of the optic nerve. Now, these are terms that will be used in today's talk, so I just wanted to clear the full forms. So IIHWP is idiopathic intracranial hypertension with papilledema, and IIHWOP is idiopathic intracranial hypertension without papilledema. It's a variant of IIHWP. So IIH does not often occur without papilledema. In a study conducted by Matthew et al., IIHWP in patients with chronic migraine was estimated to be 5 to 15%. In a similar study conducted by Bono F. et al., the presence of IHWOP in a series of patients with chronic tension type headache with transverse sinus stenosis was similar. That was around 9%. So introduction, this article explored the 2013 revision of the diagnostic criteria for IIH to reduce misdiagnosis of the subset of IIHWOP by using 3 or 4 MRI features for intracranial hypertension when a sixth nerve palsy is absent. So what is the dilemma that we face? So elevated lumbar puncture opening pressure of greater than 25 centimeter in adults and greater than 28 in sedated obese children occurs incidentally in up to 10% of normal patients. This may lead to a misdiagnosis if other supportive evidence is not required for the diagnosis of the condition. Additionally, just headache is insufficient to distinguish IIHWOP from primary forms of chronic headaches, including chronic migraine and chronic tension type headache. And the much higher prevalence of primary headache disorders compared to IIH magnifies the patients that could be misdiagnosed as having IIH without papilledema. And these patients could be exposed to complications that are associated with surgical treatments that are undertaken, such as CSF diversion, which are offered when medical therapy fails. So today's article, like I said, is the utility of magnetic resonance imaging features for improving the diagnosis of idiopathic intracranial hypertension without papilledema. It's from the Journal of Neuro-Ophthalmology with an impact factor of 1.510. The aims and objectives of this article were as follows. They were to determine whether the use of 3 or 4 MRI features in the diagnosis of IIHWOP is valid, and to evaluate the sensitivity and specificity of each of the MRI criteria, and to validate the utility for diagnosing IIH in patients with chronic headaches and elevated opening pressures, but that do not have papilledema. Method used was, it was a retrospective cohort. The study location was University of Pennsylvania, University of Utah, and University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. Approval from an ethical standards committee was taken. Study population had the following: inclusion criteria, patients diagnosed at age 17 years or older within the following groups who also had MRI studies performed, which were available for review, were chosen. So the first group was patients that had definite idiopathic intracranial hypertension with papilledema, which is defined by the revised diagnostic criteria that we saw earlier. Second group included patients with chronic headache and elevated opening pressures, that is patients with chronic headache, LPOP greater than 250 mm CSF with a normal CSF composition, normal brain parenchyma on MRI, and no papilledema. Third group was control patients which had infrequent episodic migraine and fewer than 4 days of headache per month. Clinical records, LP procedure notes, radiology reports, and CSF analyses were reviewed to ensure proper group assignment. And in addition, patients with IIHWP, WP, and CHEOP had to have the presence or absence of papilledema documented by a neuro-ophthalmologist. The exclusion criteria were patients with optic nerve gliosis or atrophy were excluded from the CHEOP group. Sample size, there were 80 patients with IIHWP, 33 patients with CHEOP, and 70 control patients with infrequent episodic migraine. In methods, MRI sequences were reviewed by a neuroradiologist from each of the participating centers. The radiologists were masked as to the clinical status of the patients to prevent bias, and each of the 4 MRI features were evaluated separately. so that the presence of one MRI finding would not influence the interpretation of another. So 4 MRI findings were documented. The first was pituitary gland height, which was measured on mid-sagittal T1 images. It was measured as the maximum orthogonal distance from the upper surface of the pituitary gland to the sellar floor. So here we can see that this particular patient had a pituitary gland height of had a pituitary gland height of 3.7 mm. So any value less than 4.8 mm is considered significant vertical compression. So our cutoff value for PGH is 4.8 mm. Second factor that was seen was ONST, that is optic nerve sheath diameter. This was measured on T2 axial images as the maximum width of the optic nerve sheath within the orbit measured perpendicular to the optic nerve. So the cutoff for ONST is any value greater than 5.5 when you average both the right and the left ONST. So if the value is greater than 5.5, then we will say that there is a significant increase in ONST. Third factor that was seen was flattening of the posterior sclera of the globe, which is nicely visible here. This was judged as forward bowing or flattening of the globe at the site of insertion of the optic nerve relative to a circular arc superimposed over the posterior sclera. So an arc is superimposed over the posterior sclera, and if there is any forward bowing of the sclera relative to the arc, then we say that this particular finding is present. So these first 3 findings were documented on contrast enhanced MRI, and this fourth finding, that is transverse venous sinus stenosis, was done using magnetic resonance venography. This scan was not done in all the patients, it was done only in a subset of patients. So now the caliber of each transverse sigmoid junction was also graded using the modified venous conduit score. A grade of 0 would say that there is less than 25% stenosis. A grade of 1 indicates 25 to 50% stenosis, and a grade of 2 indicates greater than 50% stenosis. So TSS was defined if a grade of 2 was given either for the left or the right sigmoid junction. So these were our 4 MRI features. Now coming to sensitivity and specificity of each of these features. So for each of the patient groups, the relative frequencies of the MRI features were calculated. Sensitivity and specificity values were calculated for the ability of each individual MRI feature to distinguish between idiopathic intracranial hypertension with papilledema and the controls. Sensitivity values were derived from the relative frequencies of MRI features in the patient group, that is the IHWP group, and defined as the percentage of patients, of IHWP patients with the feature. So this will tell you the true positives. And specificity values were derived from the relative frequencies of the MRI features in the control group and defined as percentage of control patients who did not have the feature. So this will tell you your true negatives. The patients could achieve at least 3 or 4 MRI features either by having, so now you have 3 features on contrast enhanced MRI and you have 1 feature on MRV. So patients should have at least 3 or 4 MRI features. The criteria being that either all 3 of the contrast enhanced MRI features, that is reduced PGH, increased ONSE and FPG is present, or by having transverse sinus stenosis on MRV in combination with 2 of PGH, ONSD and FPG. So this will give you a total of 3 out of 4. And sensitivity and specificity values were estimated for the combination of at least 3 or 4 MRI features to distinguish between the IHWP and the controls. And because some patients with IHWP MRVs, the proportion of all patients in the IHWP patient group with at least 3 of the 4 features were expected to underestimate the true sensitivity. Therefore, the sensitivity of these findings was calculated only from the subset of patients that actually underwent the MRV. So that was it for the MRI features. Now we come to the statistical analysis. Statistical analysis was performed using STATA version 14. The significance was assumed at a 0.05. Numerical and proportion data were expressed as mean values and 95% confidence intervals. The Shapiro-Wilk test was used to assess the normality of continuous variables. Welch's t-test was used to make pairwise comparisons of group means. For non-normal continuous variables, that is lumbar puncture opening pressures only, the Wilcoxon rank sum test was used. Wilson intervals were used to estimate binomial confidence intervals of proportion data, and the Fisher exact test was used to make pairwise comparisons of proportion data between groups. A receiver operating characteristic analysis was performed to evaluate the optimal threshold values for PGH and mean 1SD, and from that to maximize the sensitivity and specificity for distinguishing between the patient group and the control group. So now in our results, we can see that out of the 80 patients from the IHW.
Vaidehi, you need to speed up a little. We are running out of time. You need to speed up a little. We are running out of time.
Yes, ma'am. So MRV was done in 45 patients of the first group, 14 of the second group, and 3 of the control group. Proportion of females was more in all the 3 groups, with a mean age of around 32 in the first group and 37 in the other 2 groups. LPOP was significantly increased in the IHWP group as compared to the CHEOP group. In the results, we can see that in the IHWP group and the CHEOP group, the pituitary gland height is significantly reduced as compared to the controls. And in the ONST, we can see that in the IHWP and CHEOP groups, the optic nerve sheath diameter is significantly increased as compared to the controls. The ROC curve for PGH shows a threshold value of 4. So the threshold value of 4.8 was chosen because this was located at an inflection point on the ROC curve, and this gave a sensitivity of 80%. Sensitivity of 64% with a specificity of 80%, with an area under curve of 0.8, and the ROC curve for being located at the inflection point with sensitivity of 46 and specificity of 89. AUC was 0.73. So as the AUC for both criteria were 0.8 and 0.73 respectively, individually features only had a moderate predictive value for distinguishing patients from controls. Now the presence of at least 3 or 4 MRI features had a sensitivity of 64%, and these were present in 29 out of the patients IHWP who underwent MRV. So coming to the discussion, objective criteria for diagnosing IHWP are essential to reduce the false positive diagnosis. We have a large cohort of patients that have primary headache disorders, so they could end up having false positive diagnosis. Additionally, measurement of a single lumbar puncture opening pressure could be inaccurate because you could either be recording it at the nadir of a CSF pressure wave, or it could be falsely high due to patient pain, any Valsalva maneuver, or inappropriate positioning. The high rates of primary chronic headache disorders also poses diagnostic challenges. Patients with chronic migraine and chronic tension type headaches had a prevalence of 0.3 and 1.6 to 3 respectively in the general population. And with rising rates of obesity, IH incidence has also increased. Adding to this, migraine and other primary headache disorders could also be associated with obesity. So thus a false positive diagnosis of IH-WOP is vastly more likely than a true positive diagnosis when you're using only LPOP without any other objective criteria. The data also shows that MRI features may detect a subset of patients with IH-WOP among those with chronic headaches with elevated opening pressures. So the specificity of using at least 3 or 4 findings is nearly 100%. If you use only 3 features, then sensitivity is 64%. So that's why we need 3 or 4 findings to diagnose a rare condition like IH-WOP. We can see here that in patients with IH-WOP and CH, more than 2 features are present in these groups, whereas in the control groups, 2 to 3 features are present in very few patients. So reduced PGH was the most sensitive individual feature with a low specificity. Increased mean 1SD was less sensitive and moderately specific. FPG was the most specific individual feature but still had low sensitivity. So limitations of this study for the author were as follows. It was a retrospective study which relied on available MRI and MRV sequences. it required a presence of at least 3 or 4 MRI features as defined in the study, and that would be a clear indication for performing a lumbar puncture. However, when fewer than 3 MRI features are present, then chronically raised ICP is less certain. So, in the future, we require a standard MRI protocol that includes high resolution thin cut orbit and cellular images with MRV and OCT to document presence or absence of papilledema. Also, we require further studies to correlate between the salience of individual MRI features and diagnostic specificity to improve the ability of each criteria to diagnose the condition. In conclusion, this study examines the MRI features of intracranial hypertension in the largest cohort of patients of IHWOP to date. It represents the first study to evaluate MRI features in patients with CHEOP, which is a group that includes IHWOP patients. The results validate the presence of 3 or 4 MRI features when patient has intracranial hypertension. This would be suggestive of IHWOP in patients with chronic headache, no papilledema, and elevated LPOP. Coming to the MARI format, the method, study question, sample size is adequate, study population, inclusion and exclusion criteria are defined. Study period is not defined, and it's a retrospective observational case series. In assignment, patients aged 17 years or older were chosen, and the radiologists were masked as to the clinical status of the patients to prevent bias. Measurement and outcome assess the study's question, and outcome measurements are accurate and precise. For the statistical tests, I would like to confer with the statisticians that have joined us today. In interpretation, certain outcomes in the subgroups are different from those in the overall investigations, and all patients examined did not undergo MRBs. In extrapolation, probably the absence of papilledema is representing a natural early course of the disease. My interpretation is as follows, that a headache can be a symptom of a variety of illnesses. Knowing which headaches require intensive treatment is absolutely crucial. This particular study helps to diagnose a clinical entity which could very likely be missed due to the commonplace nature of its symptoms. Thank you very much. And we have a few questions for the moderators.
Thank you, Vaidini, for a wonderful presentation. I think we have our panelists. So, Akshay, I had some of the questions for you. One is that what is your interpretation of the article, as Vaidini has mentioned? And secondly is, how commonly do you see a patient which is referred to you with a chronic headache is diagnosed to have IIH and does not have a papilledema?
Yeah.
So Dr. Akshay, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, Vaidehi, very nice presentation. This is it's a very nicely done study. I think IIH without papilledema and without any nerve palsy, a 6 nerve palsy, is extremely rare. It's an extremely rare condition. So to actually go behind such a rare condition and perform a study to see how they can help to diagnose this, it's a very nicely done study. Now, as the article says, I think one take home that we should take from this particular study is that there is no one feature on the MRI, or there is no one clinical feature when the disease is so rare. Now, IH without papilledema is extremely rare. So just looking at that one empty cella or a partially empty cella, or a little bit of a tortuosity of the optic nerve, going behind those features in isolation is very difficult. You can't actually come to a diagnosis on that based on just 1 or 2 features on MRI. Rather, it would be a combination of findings. So I think if you have an empty cella, if you have MRV, plays a very, very crucial role. Now, there is one very nice review article by Amit Saiden from the Emory group, which says that on MR venography, if you see stenosis, then the chances of IIH without papilledema should be extremely high in our diagnosis. So MRV is extremely important. We could see that in their patients, out of 85 patients, I think 45 had MRV. Obviously, when you don't have papilledema, you won't do an MRV. So in one line, I would say it's a very important article, very important for us to know that this can exist. And takeaway is that such cases we need to treat or diagnose based on a combination of clinical features and MRI findings. How commonly do I see it in my practice? I have seen it. I've seen 2 versions of this. I've seen one where The patient was a very high myope, so it was very difficult actually to identify any edema. And the second condition was where we had an asymmetrical IH, where there was very minimal edema in one eye and no edema at all in the other eye. So we do see these cases, but very rare. When do we clinically suspect it? Again, as I said, combination of findings. So if the headache is if the pattern of headache is something that tells us that with Valsalva it's worsening. So when they sneeze or cough or strain, the headache is worsening, or it worsens when they bend their head. That is one. The second thing would be as I said, the combination of MRI findings. So if we are seeing flattening of the posterior aspect of the globe with tortuosity, not so much an empty cella, but these two features along with an MRV finding where there is some stenosis, then I would definitely suspect this condition.
Thank you, Dr. Akshay. Siddharth, to you, what is your take on the article? And second thing is, how often do you do an MRI in patients who present to you with chronic headaches? Because there are many people who have non-specific headache that present to you. And another thing is that what is the role of your OCT? Suppose if you are not seeing a papilledema. So do you really advise an OCT or optic nerve in these patients to detect papilledema?
Okay, so MRI in patients with chronic headache, again, chronic headache, the issue is with chronic headache. So if somebody comes up with a headache which is on and off for a few days, of course, you don't send them for an MRI. But if somebody who comes for headaches which have lasted for 3 months or more and which are very frequent as defined in this article, 15 days or more, then if you are not finding anything, obviously the next thing to do is an MRI. So ordering an MRI for chronic headache is not that rare. We do it even if we don't see papilledema, even if somebody has come with a long history and no other findings, and before you diagnose the patient even as migraine, you need to rule out something in the head. So ordering an MRI for chronic headache is not that uncommon. The other question you asked, whether we use OCT to find papilledema. Yes, there are times when we do OCT when there is filling of the cup, but the findings are not very typical of papilledema other than a full cup. Then I do OCT to see very subtle fluid around the nerve, and if I can actually pinpoint whether it is papilledema or not. Sometimes when there is a dilemma between optic nerve drusen and papilledema, I do a OCT to find out whether it is drusen or papilledema. But not routinely. If the cup is open, if the CD ratio is 0.3, 0.4, then doing a OCT will not yield anything. Now, many of all these, as Akshay said, that not one finding can lead to the diagnosis of raised intracranial hypertension, because all of them can happen in normal people. So empty cella can happen in normal people. You can have raised ICT in normal people. But here the term is that you have to put the clinical features, that is the chronic headache. And if you get any of these findings, then it becomes significant. But there are certain findings which are very common in normal people. Like empty cella is a very common, almost 20% of normal people can have empty cella. But instead of taking 3 signs, I would go by 2 signs. My interpretation of the article and looking at the graphs is that for me to suspect that intracranial hypertension, a lumbar tap will be required. If I get a chronic headache patient with any of the 2 MRI signs also, I will do it, because if you look at this, the probability of getting 3 signs in a normal patient, it is very less. It is 2 out of 70. So just by reducing the criteria from 3 to 2, I will increase my sensitivity largely, but compromise on the specificity by only 2 or 3%. So that is my interpretation from the article. Plus, one of the data given in one of the bar graphs is wrong. So if you can, I don't want to go back to the slide, but they keep saying it is 68 out of 80 people who had more than two positive findings in the IIH with papilledema group. It is actually 62, not 68. I don't know from where the 68 number comes, because if you total them, it is 62. If you can go back to the graph, but I don't think there is time. So my interpretation of the article is because the sensitivity and the specificity have been calculated as per the data from the papilledema group, and they are extrapolating it to the non-papilledema group, and that's why the sensitivity is dropping down to 30%. But in case of non-papilledema group, I would change the criteria from 3 to 2 signs. If I get 2 signs, I will go ahead and do lumbar puncture. That is my take clinic message.
Thank you, Siddharth. Prachi, are you around? Yeah. So I want to know what is the percentage of patients with chronic headaches at present you are getting an MRP done, and what is the significance of FPG, as they have said that it's a very, very.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you. Can you just
You can't
repeat?
hear me? Yeah. What is the indication of MRV in your practice in patients who present with chronic headaches, and how often do you do it? And second thing is, what is this article actually mentions that FPG is a very, very specific for the IIH. So do you have you seen FPG as one of the main indicator for diagnosing IIH in your practice? I mean, your take on the article?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I would like to say that ordering MRI with contrast with MR venography is the most important thing. Because many a times when an MRI is ordered for headache, it is generally a plain MRI which is ordered. And then actually the patient walks in saying that MRI is normal now. So I think that's the first basic important thing that we need to understand. Your question about getting MRV done, yes, even if I'm getting a patient scanned for 6-nerve palsy just by itself, or I order for MRV, MRI brain with contrast with MRV, is what I ask for basically. Okay. And again, about the pituitary gland height, yes, it is one of the signs that we get in IIH, but that's not, again, as we have discussed, not the only thing that we use to diagnose IIH. So that's seen pretty commonly on the MRI scan. Pretty commonly means in the patients that we are suspecting IIH, we see that very often. However, it has to be a clinical suspicion, which is confirmed with these MRI findings, and then we treat accordingly.
Thank you. I think there are some questions. Nipul, can you take these questions from the chat box? In the meanwhile, we'll have our statistical experts give the comments regarding the article. So we have, I think, Dr. Sabyasachi and we have Dr. Maninder Setia. So if anyone can unmute themselves. Dr. Seth Gupta?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Morning to everybody.
Morning.
Can I go first?
Yes.
Okay, so I think first 4 or 5 take-home messages quickly. So the title mentions clearly that this is about intracranial hypertension without papilledema. However, almost all the analysis is directed towards intracranial hypertension with papilledema. So I don't exactly understand how they're doing justice to the study question. So that is the first thing. Second thing is that I think this is more pertinent to neuroradiologists, not much for ophthalmologists. I think, purely from a clinical point of view, if somebody has a chronic headache and doesn't really have any other signs, including papilledema, refer the patient to a neurologist instead of ordering a lot of these tests. So that is, that is how I would approach it. This also shows importance of masking outside a RCT setting. So, that they have masked this. So if anybody is looking to do a study and always think about 2 things. One is a control group and one is a masking. So this study is a good example of, taking that kind of a study design. Then, like I said before, the studies, the results should have concentrated more on the chronic headache and raised EOP group, but it has not, because the 33 is quite a significant number. It's very rare to, I think, see this kind of condition. So, making that as a hero of the whole analysis would have been better, but this has not been done. Of course, in the in the introduction, they should have said what is the gold standard, because remember that we really want to study the IIH in context of no papilledema, but they have not really told us that. Then I think it's important to have included OCT RNFL thickness would have been an excellent addition to this kind of study. Also, this flattening of the posterior contour of the globe can easily be also picked up now with EDI, enhanced depth imaging OCTs and swept source OCTs. So, having these kind of imaging would also help. And lastly, from a statistical point of view, purely, what we are really doing is, studying that, that 4.8 millimeter cutoff is from a previous study. So what we are really doing here is testing how good that cutoff value is, not really testing what cutoff value should be used. So if you use a different kind of cutoff value, you get different sensitivities and specificities. So what we do is we do this ROC curve, and then we calculate something called the Yoden index. That, I mean, not to complicate things, but what we get is a cutoff value where we have the highest sensitivity and specificity. So that should have ideally been done, where they tell us that this cutoff value for pituitary height gives the best sensitivity and specificity. This thickness of optic nerve sheath gives the best sensitivity specificity. Also, it would have been good if we say that RNFL thickness of so much or beyond so much is more likely to have these and these kind of MRI features, and RNFL thickness of less than this is likely to have this and this kind of MRI features. So that might have been good to also have done, but then unfortunately OCT has not been included in this. So these are some of my take-home messages on this.
Maninder, do you have any comments on this? Dr. Maninder?
The only thing is,
Yeah.
no, I think most of the points are covered, but I guess the ROC curves in these things were too, yeah, it's right, they could have done, but the ROC curves were so, they were nearly close to the null value. So it would have been difficult to identify that one single thing in such a flat curve. So maybe the only thing they could have done is they could have combined 2 or 3 different cutoffs and come up with some sort of an algorithm, which could have been done. That could have been an added whether 1 plus 2 plus 3, whatever various cutoffs, and that could have algorithm could have been done. That's my only comment.
We have somebody in the audience who wants to come in. So please, can you unmute Dr. Jagdish Shah? I think he wants to make some comments regarding the article.
Ma'am, he can unmute himself.
Okay, Dr. Jagdish Shah, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I unmuted myself. Good morning to everyone. I'm very happy to participate in this Journal Club meeting. I have read the article, both of them, though they're very old one, and the basically what already Sabyanshi said, that this is basically a neuroradiologist related article than the ophthalmology point of view. Though Siddharth said the first seen by ophthalmologists. No, in fact, there are in the article, basically, if you see the neuroimaging signs of elevated intracranial pressure is underused in the diagnostic evaluation of the suspected pseudotumor cerebri. So the most important sign they said was the flattening of the posterior sclera to the most sensitive sign, apart from the 2 other signs, but that's the interpretation of the MRI findings. And basically this was, all the cases were seen in the chronic headache clinics in the journal, I mean, whatever the patients were seen. And then those were not, before they were referred to ophthalmologist and before they were undergone a LP to check other parameters, they wanted to find out whether they have missed out anything. That's what my interpretation. I stand corrected, because for the first time, I have interpreted this article in my manner. Now, this is a very old. So now today's MRI findings may be much, much better, because today's MRIs may be more advanced to pick up such things earlier. And what rightly said was, now since we have an OCT, we can pick up the papilledema much earlier if they are referred to us by the neurophthal or the, by the neurophysicians. Usually these are never referred to us for ophthalmology, unlike there, unless the neuro-ophthalmology has seen people and they have advised for the MRI and then the interpretation. So for a basic clinicians, what we want to discuss about this article is whether these findings are of any importance when we see a MRI plate. Then there was one more point I put up to Sabyanshi, was there was one statistical analysis was used for the match pairs. That's called McNamara and Wilconen signed rank sum tests were used. So what is as a clinician, what is the importance of this statistical analysis? So I would love to have discussed all these things in this journal club as a normal clinician.
Dr. Akshay, can you comment on the first part? And Dr. Sabyasachi, I think you can comment on the second question of Dr. Jagdish.
Sorry, my internet is a bit unstable. Could I have the first question again, please? I'm
Dr.
sorry.
Jagdish, I think he wanted to know about the role of the MRI findings and its importance as far as the ophthalmology is concerned. You know?
Yeah, very, very important. I think MRI findings are extremely important. But as we have been discussing, when there is no papilledema, it's a constellation of the symptoms that the patient has as well as the MRI findings. MRI findings in isolation, like only an empty cella, only some optic nerve kinking, don't have much of a role. But if you have 2 or 3 signs in combination, along with, say, a transient vision loss or a photopsia, sometimes patients complain of a whooshing kind of sound in the ear. These are put together, they are very important to diagnose a case of IIH when there is no papilledema. So MRI plays an extremely important role, no doubt about that.
No, I never, hello, sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. I never asked about that. I said this article basically is meant for neuroradiologist, because out of 400 odd cases of the intracranial hypertension, there were more than 320 were with the papilledema, less than 68 were without papilledema, and they all were MRI underwent before they underwent ophthalmological examinations. So that was the whole article. Whether this article is, as an ophthalmologist, how important it is to us.
Very important.
That's what
sir.
My interpretation.
Yeah, very important, sir. Because as I said, this is such a rare disease. To get papilledema, to get IIH without papilledema, we have seen a few cases. It's so rare. It's an extremely important article. I think we should all there are a lot of learning points from this article. There are pluses and minuses of the way the study is done, the tests are done, but it's an extremely important article.
Okay, thank you.
Sabyasachi, your last comment?
About the statistical analysis.
Yeah, so basically this Markman tests or these pairwise comparisons basically, from a clinical point of view, essentially there are 2 ways of looking at it. One is, before and after. So if there is if there are serial measurements, that really is when these kind of tests come in. So I'm not exactly sure how to bring these into this study, because this is a cross-sectional one. That's about it, I think.
Yeah, I think I thank all the panelists and the statistical experts for
thank you very much, Parul.
Yeah, and I think with this we'll move to the second article. Thank you, Dr. Akshay, for being here and making this webinar, wonderful webinar. And with this, I think we'll move to the second article.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Akshay. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think the second article is related to the cataract surgery, the role of anesthesia, and we have 3 moderators. Dr. Reena Vikram Bhagat, who is an anesthesiologist, who is practicing in Mumbai, and the other moderators are Dr. Vaishal Kenia and Abhijit Desai. I think they need no introduction. And with this, I think I would ask Raksha to present her JC.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Raksha Dhanuka, practicing at LM Patel Rotary Eye Hospital. I'll be presenting the second article for the day. As we all know that cataract surgery is one of the commonest surgical procedure and the most common ophthalmic surgery performed worldwide, and phacoemulsification and manual small incision cataract surgery are the 2 most popular cataract removal methods. Both can be done under topical anesthesia. There are various techniques of anesthesia: topical, peribulbar, retrobulbar, subtenon, and subconjunctival anesthesia. However, topical anesthesia stands as the anesthesia of choice as it has least complications and is patient friendly. Topical anesthesia is less painful and patient gets comfort augmented with intracameral anesthesia using lignocaine 0.5 to 1% solution. Studies have shown that lignocaine have dose-related toxicity to corneal endothelium. Various other eye drops like lidocaine, bupivacaine, benoxynate, and proparacaine have been evaluated as topical anesthetic agents. Ropivacaine, a newer amide local anesthetic, is gaining popularity on account of its favorable cardiovascular and neurological pharmacologic profile. Though its topical and peribulbar use have been evaluated, but no data is available regarding the intracameral use. Some studies have concluded that ropivacaine is safer than lignocaine on tissue and lower dose is equally effective and less toxic. Intracameral anesthetic use is questionable with respect to its toxicity to corneal endothelium, and toxicity to retina also needs evaluation if it percolates into the vitreous cavity. With this background, we come to today's article, Comparative Clinical Trial of Intracameral Ropivacaine versus Lignocaine in subjects undergoing phacoemulsification under augmented topical anesthesia. This study was done by Arun K. Sarma et al. And it was published in the year 2020 in Indian Journal of Ophthalmology and with an impact factor of 1.25. The objective of the study was to compare the safety and efficacy of intracameral ropivacaine 0.1% to lignocaine 1% in patients undergoing phacoemulsification under augmented topical anesthesia for uncomplicated senile cataract. It was a double-blinded randomized controlled trial. The study duration was 6 weeks. It was conducted after approval from the Institutional Review Board. Informed consents were taken and it was done at a tertiary center in Uttar Pradesh, India. The inclusion criteria were patients with visually significant uncomplicated senile cataract and at least 40 years of age. Any previous intraocular surgeries were excluded, and other exclusion criteria was patient with known hypersensitivity to ropivacaine or lignocaine, patients with uncooperative attitudes and communication problems. They were divided into two groups, Group A and Group B. Group A had ropivacaine 0.1% patients and Group B had lignocaine 1% patients. The subject, surgeon and observers were masked to the randomization. Pre-op diagnostic workup included routine pre-op clinical examination, cataract by LSTS3 grading, and pre-op endothelial cell count was done using a specular microscope. Surgeries were done by a single surgeon using Infinity Vision System phacoemulsifier. The surgical steps included, after making a two-planar superior corneal tunnel, either 0.2 ml of preservative-free ropivacaine or lignocaine was injected in the anterior chamber through the main tunnel as per the group assigned. After 20 seconds of intracameral phacoemulsification was done and hydrophilic acrylic foldable IOL was implanted. Effective phaco time was noted. During surgery, patients were instructed to inform verbally about any discomfort or pain. Rescue analgesia, if required during the operation in the form of topical, peribulbar, retrobulbar or sedation was also noted down. At the end of surgery, pupil size and total phaco time was noted. Visual analog scale was given to the patient to report their pain experience. For those patients who could not comprehend visual analog scale, integrated modified Wong scale in the local language was used. Now, surgeons graded their experience regarding the patient's cooperation and ease of surgery as per the below questionnaire. The parameters were patient cooperation, difficulty due to ocular movements, anterior chamber stability, complications, and pupillary size. Post-operative, on the first day, the anterior chamber reaction was evaluated by quantification of aqueous fluorescence cells using the popular Sun criteria. First post-op day, IOP was also measured by attenuation tonometer, and more than 20 was considered high and anti-glaucoma was started. Sample size of 92 was reached in each group upon assuming population of 3,000, which was the total number of cataract surgeries performed at the department in a year, with confidence level of 95% and confidence interval of 10%. The statistical analysis, descriptive statistics were used to analyze the parameters and their distribution. For categorical data, chi-square test was used, and for numerical data, student t-test or rank sum test were used. Now, 210 patients were eligible for this study, but 26 patients did not meet the inclusion criteria, so they were excluded, and we came to 184 patients, out of which 92 were divided in each group. So in each group, we had 92 patients. In the first group, Group A, 2 patients were lost to follow-up, and in Group B, 3 patients were lost to follow-up. So we landed with 90 patients in Group B and 89 in Group B. Coming to the results, the demographic details of the subjects with respect to number, sex, average age, and pre-op IOP, there was no significant difference. The cataract distribution among the group was also symmetrical, and the proportion of different grades of nuclear sclerosis was statistically similar among the two groups. The intraocular pressure in group A was 14.53 millimeter mercury and group B was 14.16 millimeter mercury, and this was statistically similar. No complications were reported due to the technique of anesthesia administration. Maximum number of patients reported pain during the bisection of nucleus in both the groups, and this was same among both the groups. Rescue anesthesia was not required in any patient. The average visual analog scale score recorded at the end of surgery was 2.29, and this distribution was not normal. The visual analog scale scores in group A, ropivacaine, to group B, lignocaine, were statistically similar. Now, if you can see this, there was a change in pupil size in both group A and group B. In group A, the change was 1.28 millimeter. In group B, it was 1.05 millimeter. On comparing intra-group between group A and group B, this difference was statistically significant. The endothelial cell count reduced in all the subjects by an average of 155.56 cells per square millimeter. And this endothelial cell loss was significantly less in group A when compared to group B. In this chart, we can see that preoperatively, despite randomization, both in group A and group B, there was a difference in endothelial cell count, and this difference was statistically significant. Post-operative, as I have already mentioned, that there was a loss of endothelial cells in both the groups, and this also was statistically significant. And as we can see, this loss of endothelial cell was less in group A as compared to group B. The endothelial cell loss was related to the effective phaco time with a correlation coefficient of 0.3. The average effective ultrasound time during the cataract surgery of all the subjects was 6.20 seconds, and on intergroup comparison in the ultrasound time during phacoemulsification was statistically insignificant. On first post-op day, the post-operative inflammation and IOP were similar in both the groups, and none of the subjects had more than 20 millimeter of mercury intraocular pressure. In regards to surgeon's experience, on the patient's cooperation and other parameters like patient's cooperation during surgery, anterior chamber stability, and overall surgical difficulty as judged by the surgeon, it was statistically similar in both the groups. Coming to the discussion, it has been found that such a study has been done for the first time that compares the efficacy and safety of intracameral ropivacaine and lignocaine. Till the time of reporting of this article, no other human studies have been reported regarding the safety of intracameral ropivacaine and or comparison to other intracameral medications in practice. There was no statistically significant difference seen on comparing group A and group B with respect to age, painful surgical steps, visual analog scale score, surgeon score, post-operative inflammation, and average ultrasound time during phacoemulsification. But there was significant reduction in the post-operative endothelial cell count in both the groups. The average endothelial cell loss was 7.8% in group A and 9.7% in group B. Group A subjects had significantly less loss of endothelial cells when compared to group B. Pupillary dilatation augmentation by intracameral anesthesia was significant in both the groups, and this increase in the pupillary diameter was statistically more pronounced in group A when compared to group B. The study shows that on using intracameral ropivacaine or lignocaine, the pain experienced during the surgery is comparable, the analgesia is sufficient to complete the surgery safely, the use of intracameral lignocaine or ropivacaine is safe to corneal endothelium, and it definitely augments the pupillary dilatation. Author has come to a conclusion that intracameral ropivacaine is equally effective to lignocaine in providing analgesia and superior in maintaining mydriasis and safety of endothelial cells, which makes it a preferable choice for intracameral use as anesthetic agents. Now coming to the MARI format, the study question was well defined and relevant. It was a well-designed study. The inclusion and exclusion criteria were well defined. It was a prospective double-masked randomized study. The outcome measures were appropriate. However, the method of measurement of pupil size was not mentioned, whether it was manual or using a software, and surgeon's score questionnaire was also not validated. The statistical tests were appropriate. The endothelial cell loss as measured by specular microscope was significantly less in ropivacaine group in comparison to lignocaine, and it was measured using a specular microscope. But the retest variability has not been mentioned, and there was increase in mydriasis in both the groups. High-risk group like cataract with uveitis, cataract with previous operated eyes were excluded from this group. Systemic conditions which could have affected the corneal endothelium like diabetes mellitus, chronic renal failure, smoking were also excluded. Eye drops like tamsulosin and other alpha blockers that can impede pupil dilatation were not inquired for use preoperatively. One important point that OCT should have been documented pre and post-op to rule out retinal toxicity. If this was a tertiary care center and ERG was available, they should have also documented ERG to rule out any functional retinal toxicity. Another that the hypersensitivity to lignocaine and ropivacaine, how it was tested, whether it was just an history or any subcutaneous test was done, this has also not been mentioned. So we need further studies are needed to support the findings. Thank you. There are certain questions for the moderators.
So thank you, Dr. Raksha, for a very, very nice presentation. So we can start with Dr. Abhijit first with regards to the experience.
Nupur,
yeah.
Nupur, I think Reena has to leave, so can you just ask first, Reena?
Okay, yeah, right. So Dr. Reena, we'll just take your comment about the intracameral ropivacaine and lignocaine. Like as an anesthetist, what is your interpretation of this article? Any comments?
Yes, see, since this is the first kind of a study for intracameral ropivacaine, I have per se no first-hand experience on this. But ropivacaine I have used for peribulbar anesthesia, which is significantly better than lignocaine alone. And ropivacaine has got little less lipophilic effect. So the systemic side effect of ropivacaine is less than bupivacaine, and it gives the benefit of longer duration than lignocaine. And it has got one significant use as it has got vasoconstrictive effect. So the systemic absorption is less and the systemic side effects are less. And there is no need of using epinephrine because it is already vasoconstrictor. So systemic absorption and all will not be changed by using epinephrine in the solution. And what preparation we get is we get preservative-free ropivacaine in the market, which is available in 1%, 0.75%, 0.5%, and 0.2%. And in this study, we are using 0.1%. So that is quite less concentration with equal effects. And lignocaine is very short acting. It acts in 5 to 10 minutes, but the duration is quite less. So the intracameral absorption of lignocaine is usually in 5 minutes, cornea and iris, they absorb lignocaine and it is flushed out in 8 to 9 minutes. But for bupivacaine, since we have ropivacaine, we have never used it, so we don't know the duration of intracameral ropivacaine. But definitely it has to be higher than lignocaine. And the systemic side effects are much less than bupivacaine, so it has to be better. I feel we need further studies on this. And the most important thing is the systemic absorption of the drug leading to cardiotoxicity or CNS toxicity, which is most feared thing for the ophthalmologist. So bupivacaine is very much cardiotoxic and ropivacaine is quite less cardiotoxic. So given a choice, and the duration of action of lignocaine is for anesthesia in peribulbar is 1 to 2 hours, whereas bupivacaine is 6 to 8 hours and ropivacaine is 4 to 6 hours. But with less systemic side effect, I would prefer we can use bupivacaine in 0.5% or 0.2% solution for peribulbar anesthesia. And for topical, why we are not using bupivacaine is it can cause corneal opacity and corneal thickening. But for ropivacaine, we have no studies, so I have no idea about it. for the topical use also and for intracameral use also. But for peribulbar, definitely bupivacaine is less. I will use ropivacaine more than bupivacaine. And it is preservative-free one solution we get in market. So the toxicity is almost nil for the preservatives.
I just have one question for you, Reena. Is that
Yeah.
we are looking at not for the cataract surgery, but when we are looking at a retina surgery or a cornea
Yeah, for
surgery?
retinal surgery also because the duration of action is longer than lignocaine. So repeated use of intracameral or topical lignocaine may lead to corneal edema or thickening, and it may hinder the vision during surgery for the surgeon. If you are using topical lignocaine or intracameral, you will have to use it repeatedly. So the toxicity will be more with repeated use because of its shorter duration of action. But for ropivacaine, since it is long acting, you will have to use it less repeatedly with less systemic side effects. And
But
there
what
is
about
something called,
motor effects?
sorry?
Motor effects, because they are supposed to be less as
Yeah,
compared to analgesia.
yeah. Motor effect is usually, see, this is 94% bound to proteins and it has got prolonged duration of action. It is lipophilic. So the motor blockade is more than lignocaine and less than bupivacaine. So some surgeons like squint surgeons, they don't like to use bupivacaine for the peribulbar infiltration because they feel it is myotoxic. But for ropivacaine, it is not so myotoxic. So we can always use that. So I feel it is more, analgesia is more than lignocaine and motor blockade is less than bupivacaine. So it is a very well balanced solution to use for both topical and intracameral use. But further studies will tell how much toxic it is with repeated uses.
Yeah, thank you.
There's a question for you, Dr. Reena, by Dr. Shaheen Zaveri. Dosage of ropivacaine in peribulbar. What's the dosage that you use?
I use 0.5%. You can use 0.75 also, but I use 0.5% solution.
And you mix it with hydinase, ropivacaine?
Yeah, you can mix it with hydinase. It depends on surgeon.
You're mute. You're mute. Dr. Reena, you're on mute. You need to unmute yourself. Dr. Reena, you need to unmute yourself. Yeah, we couldn't get the last comment. Yeah.
Hello?
Hello, yeah. We couldn't get your last comment. Yeah.
Yeah, see, it depends on the surgeon. Some surgeon mix it and you can mix it, and without mixing also you can use it. There is no issue with that.
Do you use lignocaine along with that?
Yeah, we can use mix lignocaine and ropivacaine both. Like we use bupivacaine and lignocaine.
Can I
Go on to Dr. Vaishnav
I
and
think,
Dr.
yeah. So I just wanted to say that both of them, lignocaine and ropivacaine, can have a synergistic action.
Yeah, because synergistic means lignocaine is a faster acting.
Fast acting, yeah.
It will immediately act, and ropivacaine is a longer acting drug. So it has got synergistic effect, and so you can start the surgery immediately and for a prolonged duration of.
So for retinal surgeries, especially we have been using combination of lignocaine with bupivacaine. We can use it lignocaine with ropivacaine. So the analgesia is for a longer time, almost maximum analgesia with ropivacaine is up to 6 to 7 hours, but the analgesia is found up to 13 hours. So that's quite good. Post-operative comfort would be good.
Post-operative, yes.
I just have one comment. I have a very small experience with ropivacaine use in a peribulbar. So years back, my anesthesiologist said that ropivacaine is there. And somehow, for all my corneal surgery where I needed motor movements also, it was not as effective. So I still probably would prefer to go to bupivacaine in if given a choice rather than ropivacaine.
Yeah, that's why
probably ropivacaine.
That's why Parul, you are using it synergistically.
No, I use combination with lignocaine with ropivacaine.
Yeah, so lignocaine will have a better motor effect.
No, no.
I somehow was not very happy.
See, because the penetration of lignocaine is better for the myelinated nerve fibers. So it will work better on the motor nerve fibers.
No, no, no. It is usually bupivacaine, which has got maximum penetration. So that's why you get dense akinesia with bupivacaine. So nothing can compete for akinesia with bupivacaine. And then comes ropivacaine and then lignocaine. So akinesia, what you will get is least with lignocaine, then with ropivacaine, and maximum with bupivacaine.
So we have, I think, Abhijit here. Abhijit, you have a lot of exposure to use of the lignocaine jelly on the surface, and you don't use intracameral lignocaine. So would you be able to tell whether in your practice intracameral ropivacaine has some role and you could avoid the use of jelly, especially when we don't have the jelly which is available for the ophthalmic use?
So first of all, let's go about it systemically. The first thing was we were talking about the systemic side effects of ropivacaine. So for us as ophthalmologists, we really wouldn't make a difference because we are using it topically or intracamerally. The second thing is, even in the study, the augmentation method has not been clearly mentioned. What kind of a surface anesthesia was used before using the intracameral. So whether it was ropivacaine with ropivacaine, or it was lignocaine with ropivacaine, or it was proparacaine with ropivacaine, that's not been mentioned. Apart from that, in the endothelial, they have just done the endothelial cell count, and as it's been rightly pointed by the presentation, they have not given the intertest variability, how to remove the bias for the intertest variability. But the main effect of ropivacaine is on the hexagonality of the corneal endothelium. So that has not been studied in this particular study as well. So the coefficient of variation and 6A, that would have been very helpful. So there's a study in which they had done it on the rabbit eyes, and they said that 0.01% intracamerally was the safest for the endothelium compared to that, and we are using 0.1%. So that's again a slightly dicey situation for me here. So if we are not getting, coming to the question, if we are not getting lignocaine jelly, I think Oculan is good enough. That is preservative-free intracameral lignocaine. And maybe I would use ropivacaine for more complicated cases, like maybe small pupils, or wherein I'm going to do a pupillary stretch, or kind of complicated cases with zone dialysis, or I'm expecting a longer time of surgery in excess of 15-20 minutes.
Vaishal, to you. So what is your experience with intracameral? Because I think you use intracameral anesthetic agents. So
no, I don't use intracameral anesthetic agents at all. Okay. Most probably, most of the surgeons who are doing topical anesthesia would agree with me that the requirement of intracameral anesthesia is very, very minimal. As Abhijit said, it would be just in cases where the pupil is small or the manipulation of the iris is more. Then, you know, basically in this study, what I wanted to point out, as Abhijit said, the surface anesthesia has not been mentioned. Secondly, there are a lot of bias factors and confounding factors in the interpretation. The pupillary size, if you see the preoperative pupil size difference is already 0.2 millimeters, and post-operatively, the pupil size is around 0.15 millimeters. So there is not much difference in the pupil size. One. Second is the endothelial cell which has density which has been measured, but they have not mentioned the surgery duration, because it's not just the phaco time which is important. Even the irrigation aspiration occurring during the surgery also affects the endothelial cells. So from this confounding factors, you cannot interpret that ropivacaine is more less endothelial toxic. The other take-home message is that most of these surgeries today, we are doing a closed chambers phaco or SICS, and that's why we can do topical anesthesia. Lignocaine being more lipophilic, the penetration would be much better than ropivacaine, which I feel. So for topical anesthesia, if the penetration is much better, the intracameral concentration achieved would be much better. So to my mind, lignocaine, which I have used for so many years, I don't feel any other agent to be substituted because I'm happy with it. Is that way. And just a comment about the gel. I've been using gel also initially, but then abandoned using the gel. Though the anesthesia achieved with the gel is far better, but sometimes it causes epithelial toxicity. That's why I switched over just to topical eye drop anesthesia.
Yeah, thank you. Actually,
so Dr. Parul, with respect to the endothelial cell count, even Dr. Zain Khatib had a query that whether the validity...
He could be asking him.
Yeah. Because that
we'll unmute him when he wants to ask his question. So first, let's just finish with the moderators, and then we'll go to the chat box. So Vaishnav, I just had some one more comment. Is that when you're looking at patients who are high myope or who have IFIS, I think in those patients this modality of intracameral use is more useful. Besides the complicated cases, because you are likely to have more of pain experienced by people who are high myope. So if you're not subjecting these patients to the perivulvar block, I think intracameral anesthesia makes...
See, in IFIS, the issue is something different. In IFIS, the dilator when in IFIS, the iris is very mechanical sensitive. If you touch the iris, it'll constrict, it'll be miost. So adding an intracameral anesthetic won't make much of a difference unless you're using hooks or anything to stretch it, as Abhijit said. So to my mind, it doesn't add value to in a IFIS case per se.
It's the muscles, the iris muscles.
Yeah, epinephrine have been used, intracameral epinephrine has been used. But to me, intracameral anesthesia is more important nowadays is because today we are becoming ocular surface conscious, We want to put less preoperative anesthesia. We are going more towards intracameral mediatrics and of NSAID eye drops. NSAID eye drops have a very good importance of preoperative in maintaining mydriasis. So nowhere that has also been mentioned in the article, because that is also which has been a dictum. Everyone is using an NSAID preoperatively so that the we have been told that the mydriasis is sustained because of NSAID, because the prostaglandins which are released, and especially when you are doing a femto-assisted cataract, it becomes imperative to use an NSAID.
Thanks. I think we have Rohit Modi. So Rohit, can you have some comment on the statistical part of the study and the previous study too? Rohit?
Yeah. Thanks, Dr. Parul. For the previous study, just for the pure statistical point of view, Fegan's nomogram would have been interesting since they have calculated the sensitivity and specificity of the MRI findings. We could have got the likelihood ratio and we know the pre-test probability in terms of patients who have chronic headache with elevated opening pressure and without papilloedema. And in those patients, if these findings are there individually or in group, we could know the post-test probability. The nomogram is very simple to apply. You can Google it like Dr. Sabyasachi has suggested in the chat box. And if you know the likelihood ratio, which is easily calculated, that is sensitivity upon 1 minus specificity, we can apply that and know what's the post-test. For example, let's say, when we have a case of ocular TB, you have a finding like serpeginoid choroiditis, which is high likelihood of TB, and a positive MANTU test, it adds a very high value to such a case. So similar thing could have been done for patients in the study. For the second paper, just couple of things like Dr. Raksha said, we can know the test retest variability of the machine for which the endothelial cell count was done. I feel Dr. Parul would be a better judge to comment upon the difference in the endothelial cell count, whether it was clinically relevant, because they are showing only a difference of 30 or 40. So even clinically non-relevant difference in two groups can be statistically be significant if there are enough numbers or the sample size is large enough. That may be the case in this patient. So I may not agree with the author stating that ropivacaine is much more safer with respect to the endothelial toxicity. But a cornea specialist like Dr. Parul would be a better person to comment.
To be frank, I've been using only lignocaine intracamerally, and I use a very low concentration than what is recommended. So, and I use it as an infusion. There are people who use it as a bolus injection. There are people who use it as an infusion. So really, whether that would also make a sense in terms of endothelial cell count or cell toxicity. I really have, and about the endothelial cell toxicity in this article, probably I would also not be in a position to tell you whether there is any significant endothelial cell toxicity. Obviously, when you see a cataract surgery, you do see a amount of cell loss. So whether the anesthesia itself has added on to an increased cell loss is something which I don't think so I can comment on about this article. But overall, I think these the group which is discussing about the intracameral anesthesia, they have a very good experience of intracameral anesthesia. I think they have a couple of articles previously also published with lignocaine and bupivacaine and other things, you know. And they seem to be, I think, one of the groups. I feel that they have done a fair this thing. It's a fair article, you know, because the analysis also, I thought that it was pretty okay. I'm not the statistical expert, but I thought that it was quite good. And their clinical experience did matter here, you know. So about the endothelial cells, I'm not sure whether when you have a pre-operatively, the cell counts itself were not matching in the group, you know. And post-operatively, you are having, so though they have said that they have taken into account that exact value and not the percentage decrease, you know. So they have taken the exact loss of the cells. So I am really not in a position to comment about this article. Vaishal or Abhijit, do you have any comment on the endothelial cells? Because you all, being an anterior segment surgeon, do you have any?
I think all the points suggest that the interpretation about the endothelial cell count, where ropivacaine is less toxic, we cannot interpret from this article for sure. Because as I said, there are many confounders and bias still there, because even the time of the surgery, total duration of the surgery has not been mentioned. And what surface anesthetic has been used, even that has not been mentioned. So there are too many confounding factors there to interpret directly and say. I feel the design of the study would have been better if there would have been a third arm where only topical anesthesia was there, just to compare whether intracameral really works or not.
Yeah, maybe. That may be a good comment. Yeah. Do we have Maninder? Maninder, do you have any comment on the statistical part and the study design?
I can start and then I can...
Who can start?
Dr. Sengupta can start.
Yeah, is Dr. Sengupta there? Sabyasachi?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah,
yes.
okay. So,
okay. So,
Maninder wants to follow you.
No, first of all, some conflict of interest, because I being the associate editor of the journal, and these go through me. Well, that doesn't mean I'm not going to comment or critique it, just that. Okay, so I think in the beginning that title should have the word randomized, because it's important to declare even before starting that this is a randomized trial, and that word augmented in the title is really not essential, because I think Abhijit said just now that they have not told us anything about the surface anesthetic, and Vaishal also said that. So that augmented word is useless. And then I think even when we are writing or when we are reading, it's very difficult to remember what is this group A and group B. So I urge everyone to say, here you can say group R and group L, and that makes it much easier. then they just give the p values in the abstract. They don't give us any actual metrics here. So that is quite poor. I think anytime that we are starting to read an article, we first need to understand what are they actually studying here. We don't know what they are studying, right? I mean, what is the thing that they're studying? There maybe could be many things that we are studying, but what is the thing that we're studying here is something that they should mention. So given that this is an anesthetic and analgesia derived study, we should be studying the visual analog scale. I think that should be the primary outcome measure. But if you look at how they have described it, it is almost non-existent. We don't really know what is the visual analog scale score in one group versus the other group at all. They just give the overall visual analog scale. So that is extremely poor that they have not told us exactly what they're studying. That's why, whether this endothelial count is good, if that endothelial count is the primary outcome measure here, then we interpret it differently. If it is not the primary outcome measure here, we interpret it separately. So the primary outcome measure is not defined. They give us the consort diagram, but then again, there are lots of lacunae in that diagram. And of course, it's already been said that the total phaco time is essential and not the effective phaco time. They should have, monitored the heart rate and blood pressure of patients as well to understand, if there is any systemic up and down which is happening. I don't understand how they have masked the surgeon in this. There is a clear sentence which says the subject, surgeon, and observer were masked in the randomization. How do you mask the surgeon in this? Because they are two entirely different companies. One is Neon Laboratories and one is Sun Pharma. So it's very clear, as soon as you look at the syringe that, this is one or the other. So then that 0.1% is not available at all. Dr. Jagdish has also commented and Dr. Reena has also commented, the 0.1% is not available. So then how did they use it for a study? Was it specifically tailor-made for a study? I don't think so. So there is something, there's a lot of mischief here. That's how it looks like. The primary outcome measure should have been the visual analog scale. Sample size calculation is extremely poor. It cannot be based on the total population and the total number of surgeries that you're expected to do in a year. It should be entirely based on the primary outcome measure, so which is not at all defined here. So we don't really know. Then the endothelial count is totally to be ignored in this patient, in this study, because first of all, we don't know whether there's a primary outcome measure or not. And second thing is that like Zain has already pointed out, it is mainly the driver of endothelial count is not this drug, but most likely the effective phaco time, maybe the age. So, that analysis has not been presented to us. And then that patient cooperation evaluation by the surgeon, it is not at all understandable. So how did that surgeon exactly do this? How did he give that score? And difference in the endothelial count at baseline should never happen if the randomization is done properly. So then there are too many lacunae in this paper to, to be actually even publish this kind of paper. So unfortunately, it has gone through the sieve, and I am the editor, in the editorial board. So this shouldn't really happen, but unfortunately, it has. It gives us an opportunity to learn from papers like this. That's about it.
So you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
so my question to Dr. Sengupta would be: do you have? Does IGO have a policy of filling up the consort form when a randomized trial is submitted?
So it is not really mandated as of now.
But I think
though we have provided all of these forms on the website.
But I guess for now, all journals require the consort form to be sent in along with the randomized trial, because this trial is not at all according to the consort format. It's very poorly written.
Exactly.
It's very poorly written, and I'm surprised in 2020 such a trial has been published. If you go through the consort, checklist, more than 50% of the things are not there in the trial.
Yeah,
so it's a very poor, I mean, I don't know the authors, and I don't know whether people are sitting over here or not, but I'm surprised that this has gone through. It's very good.
So that's why my disclaimer before I started that, well, that's how it is.
So we have Dr. Jagdisha who wants to comment. Yeah, I think he can unmute himself. Yeah.
So we have criticized that why this article is chosen, but accordingly, I believe that even though except the augmented word, and the this thing. Otherwise, I believe that these people have done really a point that ropivacaine can be used intracamerally compared to lidocaine, and though the cell loss is lesser, but it's just extra use. So I would say they've tried to make an attempt to use this medicine for the purpose of intracameral use. The only thing is what they have compared with the study of 2002, where the phaco time was, about 21 minutes or 22 minutes, which we don't take anymore. So that's not fair. Secondly, they are trying to compare with the studies done on the rabbits in Japan, this particular. So that is also not true. But overall, I agree with all the comments made by Dr. Vaishal and Sabyanti and all them that this is not a good study, but I would say they've made a good attempt. Unfortunately, I could not get the 0.2%, what is a trade name or a brand name on the Google. So I wrote an email to Dr. Sanjeev Gupta and he replied to me that they have used injection 0.02%. Now, this injection is very well used for the lumbar puncture, quite commonly for the spinal anesthesia. So therefore, this injection is very well used. So therefore, there is an attempt to use in the intracameral. That's my comment. We criticize the article, but overall, it was a good attempt. That's what I believe.
I also had just one comment that the article may not be very good, but ultimately, as a clinician, if I look at it, if I want to use an intracameral ropivacaine, it gives me some, scope of doing it based on this article. So it gives me that, okay, this can be used because there is some part evidence in terms of, their studies. So does have a clinical relevance in my practice, definitely. So it may not be a very good study,
Parul, the only thing which I want to comment, hello?
You can.
Yeah.
Last 2 minutes,
Yeah. That ropivacaine, the only advantage is the analgesia is prolonged. So the post-operative comfort for the patient would be much better. That is the only thing which I can see using ropivacaine versus lidocaine.
That's for cataract surgery. But what about the non-cataract surgery? We are actually.
So we are just talking about intracameral and topical anesthesia. So it's
same thing.
It's
even
for cataract surgery.
Sometimes you can use it during keratoplasty when you have the patient's pain coming back. So intracameral use of these agents are done. So that
Secondly,
is
nothing is mentioned about use of viscoelastic.
No use of viscoelastic and the technique of viscoelastic.
Basically, we don't have a benchmark as to the concentration of ropivacaine for intracameral.
Absolutely.
So this is first of its kind. So probably we'll need to have a further dissection whether we can use a still diluted version, which would be endothelial friendly. So maybe we are looking at 0.05% intracamerally, which would be helpful.
Yeah, I think with this,
there were 92 cases in each group. It was properly double mask study in a sense. I just have to say. And A and B group.
I just wish that they had studied. I just wish that they had studied analgesia.
Analgesia, yeah.
Reported
yes.
It.
Absolutely.
I reported it.
That was.
They have done a VSA analog.
Unfortunately,
they have done a VSA analog for both the
not
cases.
Reported anything.
Yeah, I
very
think
poorly reported. Poor.
Yeah. So I thanks all the panelists and the presenters and BOA to give us this opportunity to have our JC discussion on their platform. And thank you, Dr. Jagdish Shah, to make it a better discussion. And thank you, Dr. Sabyasachi, Dr. Rohit, Dr. Maninder, for assessing the article in a much better way. So I think with this, we end this session of Journal Club, and I think everybody is free to leave the JC session. Thank you.
Have a lovely day, all of you.
Yeah. Bye.